this
Got
computer.
it? Okay.
Okay. So the goal is to kind of just change our understanding in terms of how we see the medieval world being this largely agrarian sort of thing. Really, all of what we're going to focus on are events that happen somewhere after about 1000, because there is this sort of commercial revolution that happens across Europe after about 1000. And, you know, it's a bit of a joke where people talk about, you know, people suddenly woke up and wanted to go shopping. But there's a lot of things in terms of trade and commerce and banking that come online after about 1000 that drive the economies across Europe. And so the kinds of things happening in England would not have been happening prior to about 1000, not extensively, in terms of trade and that sort of stuff. So anyway, so a couple things about England that we know. We got about 5 million people. At any given time from 1000 to 1500, depending on the region, a certain percent of the people are engaged in non-ag related kinds of activities. The roles are fluid because people switch jobs. Ag workers do other things during other times of the year, so it's not like we think of it in the modern world. But when we look at the roles, at the censuses, they're listing themselves as a profession other than like farmer ag. They're listing themselves as cloth makers or other kinds of things. So anyway, and as we're going along, make sure you hit the chat to get the roll done, okay? And so we have a lot of interesting things that are happening in England that have to do with these mills, for instance. Now, one of the things that the mills are really around since ancient times, right? The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, they have water wheels, they have windmills, they've got all of these sorts of things, but they really don't take off in any kind of sustained way until the high medieval area. And one of the things to keep in mind is the Mediterranean is a different climate zone, and they just don't have as much rain or precipitation. And so they don't have small streams or rivers or the kinds of things to drive these kinds of things in an efficient way. And one of the things we see in England and in places in Northern Europe where we've got this more coastal climate pattern, it's rainier, it's drizzlier more of the year, so you've got lots more little streams, you got lots more of these little rivulets that allow these kinds of water wheels and things to be in use. Instead of maybe 50 to 100 days of the year, you're getting 250 days of the year that the water wheel can be running. And this is enough that large-scale investment into these kinds of machines would make economic sense in southern England and other places where they really didn't make good economic sense in the Mediterranean. And so there's some very good reasons why the Greeks and the Romans never industrialized, but we see these kinds of things happening in later periods and in these northern areas, mostly because we've got a different climate pattern that makes it economically feasible. So anyway, so when we look at the Doomsday Survey, 1086, there listed 7,000 water mills of one sort or another across England, okay? And we're gonna walk through this in a little more detail, but even by 1086, there's a lot of these large scale machines, and they're part of people's everyday lives, right? Now, they're maybe not as complex as we think of as complex machines today, but they're still complex, large machines that people are building. Now, typically, what we're going to see most of these are going to be water-driven mills that are for making flour, right? Grinding grain so that people can have flour for bread and things. These things are very expensive. Usually, they would be perhaps part of the manorial estates, and so the local lord would provide that along with the bread ovens and other common things that the Lord would provide. And we have the tithing. So if you have 100 pounds of flour that you made, 10 pounds of it goes to the Lord for the use of the mill, or just like the bread ovens and these other communal things. But in lots of areas of England, these things were not provided by the Lord. They were provided by various peasants or various local people would come together and they would build and maintain these things, and they would literally be shareholders where they would get these things paid back. And by 1500, they would actually get cash payments. And so some of these early experiments that we see with these water wheels and water mills in England have groups of people coming together and investing and running these things for shared profit. And these are some of the cultural antecedents that are very important for the Industrial Revolution later, because these sorts of things are already part of the cultural milieu. And they're not the kind of thing that you think.
Ryan, I said quit.
Okay, I will. Oh, sorry.
If you don't have a question, go ahead and mute.
Yeah. Okay. So, like I said, these are what I just talked about. Here in the side picture is kind of a drawing of what a typical mechanism for a vertical water wheel would be, with the grinds, and that would go out and drive a flour grinding. Before about 1100, a lot of the water mills are going to be what's called horizontal mills, and they were actually installed at one side or the other of a bridge. And so it basically is flipped and the shaft coming up, that sort of stuff. So here's an example of one area where we can see what the amounts of these water mills would be. So we've got a 9-mile run that drops 120 feet, right? And in 1510, there's 200 water mills in this 9-mile stretch of river. That's a lot of water mills. That's very industrialized, very developed. And in 1510, it's corn, it's snuff, it's paper, it's all sorts of things that these mills are doing. But the people living in this area, they would have these large water-driven machines. They're just literally everywhere, okay? And there's other rivers that we'll see. 1600 in High-Weald, there's going to be 200 blast furnaces that are driven by water mills. Conversion forges, large hammers. 1550 on the Stroud River in Gloucester, there's over 200 mills that have to do with doing wool and like, so they're just all over the place. There's lots of these large, complex machines. Okay, we have the site in Devon, in Devon, 150 mill sites. And if we look at this image here, this is like a 3-mile section of the Rivelin River, and you can just see how there's all these archaeological sites today of all of these mills. And so these are all sites that we know of today that date from the late medieval, early modern period. And so if you see the scale here, half a mile, this is maybe 4 miles, okay? And so these suckers, the mills are all over the place. And this is part of us transforming our understanding of medieval England, is to see this change that happens after 1100. We're seeing lots and lots of these things being managed all over the place, okay? All right, so I already kind of mentioned this before we got recorded, but this stuff goes back to the ancient Greeks, and it's really about the climate, the different climate that we see in England and other places that really make the building of these economically feasible. The Mediterranean climate just doesn't support this sort of stuff as an economic investment, because you just don't get enough use out of them. Okay, and I mentioned before that in the 12 and 1300s, we have lots of peasants and other smallholders as literally being entrepreneurs, building these sorts of things. And this is a pattern we see in England that we don't see as much on the continent in terms of the manorialism. More on the continent, the large lords and that are going to be building more of these. But in England, we see a lot more of this sort of thing. Okay, another example, people in, okay. We got another example where we got a whole bunch of 12 mills and a 5-mile run. Okay. Now we also have other versions going on. It's not all water-driven mills all over England. We got windmills and we got tide mills. Okay. So some more examples here in some of the counties in the 1100s, right? Kent had 139 water wheels, windmills, and some tide mills. A little hard sometimes to tell tide mills from the rolls. You just have to look at the location. Obviously, the tide mills are going to be right on the coast, right? And then, in 1600, Kent has got over 267 windmills. In fact, tons of these windmills are, don't survive other than in place names and things like that. But the coastal areas were dotted with these large windmills. Again, doing a variety of different sort of functions. Okay, there we go. Here's just a picture of what a medieval windmill would look like in case people are having problems. And in the gray area over here is a tide mill. And as you can see, it looks like just a regular building. And you've got the paddles, the drivers, but it's the tide coming in and the tide going out that's driving this machine. And there would be a clutch-like device that you could throw a gear across so that you could drive whatever you wanted as the tide's coming and going. But tide mills are going to function pretty much like your regular water wheels. The tide mills were both vertical and horizontal, depending, but same sort of mechanism, just using the tide to generate that energy. Okay, so we got these things are all over the place. What are they getting used for? Well, obviously the single largest category are going to be grinding grains and stuff like this. All right, but the next is going to be textiles, especially as we get into, we've got textiles is, the universal technology, right? As archaeologists are showing us now, we've got Neanderthal textiles, right? We've got people, for as long as we've got record of people, they've been making string and thread and weaving and making stuff. And so obviously we're going to be seeing that as well. So, but one of the things we see after 1000 is we see the horizontal looms coming online and the fullering process with respect to processing our wool gets mechanized. And so we see a lot of these water-driven mills that are speeding up this sort of process. And so that's spreading out all over the place. And we have actually records, exactly the first one that gets it. And then by 1250, you notice we've got a whole bunch of people in some of these counties in terms of the textile, whether it's the water-driven fullering process and these horizontal looms. We see in 1250 Northampton, Lincoln, Oxford. These were a lot of people who on the rolls, their primary identification is cloth worker, right? In terms of who they are and the extent. And this is one of the things that when we're looking at the records in England, England's wonderful because there's all of these records that survive and people say what they're doing, right? And there's all this stuff in counties, and the Public Records Office in England is just fantastic. You can look up just whatever you want and you go in there and 20 minutes later they show up with the sheets and you actually get a look at the actual documents. I didn't on these, but we have just massive amounts of detail stuff that people have gone through in terms of examining economic activity by county every year from 1000 on pretty much. But by 1300, these fullering mills, though, they move from the urban areas where all the weaving and stuff is. And most people understand that it's just access to the water power, and it's just a little closer to the sheep and more of that stuff's happening. But these big fullering mills tend to be more rural after the first introduction. Okay, and here's just an example of what one of this fullering stuff is, with the wheel driving these big hammers that work it. And the black and white image here, I should have left it color. I was setting this up so I could print it if I wanted. And you can't see, but this is actually the black and white on the side. What we're seeing is the second floor, and there's holes in the floor where the big wheels were. And the water-driven mill is driving about half a dozen of these big hammer-like devices for working the wool. Okay. Another area that we see a lot of water-driven technology involved is the iron industry. And especially in southern England, the iron industry goes all the way back to Roman, pre-Roman times. So, and it has to do with a couple things, but basically for iron industry to function in the medieval world, you need to have easy access to iron. They're not going to be punching huge mines. It's going to be surface access to iron. And the way the geologic uplift between the north and south downs are, it's essentially kind of like a dome, and it erodes away. And so you've got all of these areas where these iron deposits are just on the surface. And then people in Roman times and before would just do these pit mines, and they would grow and all that stuff. So the iron ore was easily accessible. There's the water supply to drive the forges and strip hammers because it's rugged up and down area with the rain. and there's lots of wood. One of the themes to all of this is going to be this wood fuel economy. Everything's driven by wood supply and access to it. And so a lot of these endeavors not only have to do with the access of water for driving the mills, but also access to wood. And I note here, the charcoal industry was major, but charcoal is real friable. You can't ship it very far, right? It doesn't ship very well. And so the industries have to be close to the woods. And that's one of the main things that happened with the Industrial Revolution, with the shift to coal up in central England, is coal you can ship all over the place. And so the industry doesn't have to be right where the resource is. But anyway, so this image here just shows a very simple early kind of forge where we still have a bloomery type of iron industry, and we've got bellows, and the bellows are just being driven by the simple transfer of mechanical energy from a water wheel. Okay, the Weald region in southern England has all these things, right? And if we look here, we know one example of the industry in 1256 is purchase of 30,000 horseshoes and 60,000 nails, right? And we have records of when Henry goes to war in France, orders of like 1 million arrowheads, right? And so between Sussex, Kent, there was 750,000 arrowheads were ordered. And you think about the logistics of the economy to just put an arrow out for 750,000 arrowheads. And so you have to have this industry and all these complex things behind it to make these kinds of things happen. Okay. Besides just the bellows to put do the bloomeries, the water wheels were used to create these large hammers. And the hammers were really used two ways. One of them is to crush up the ore to make it more useful. And also when the bloom comes out, you would pound it to get all of the impurities out and have something that you could use. And then there would be water-driven hammers also that would be used in processing that into wrought iron, pig iron, and that then would go out to the secondary industrial sources that would then make it into chunks that then would go out to the blacksmiths, right? So we've got these 3 zones, and the first 2 zones on the iron industry would have these large water wheels to drive stuff. Now, just as kind of an aside, we've got this really nice record that survives from 1325 of the Tudley Manor, and we have a bloomery operation that ran for about 50 years. And we've got detailed financial records about this, and it provides a real nice snapshot that then we can speculate about how this iron industry might have worked, right? Because we've got all this detailed record on one, and so it leads us to say that, well, maybe all those other ones were kind of similar, right? And so what do we got? We got a bloomery. It ran, notice it runs for between 200 and 250 days a year. And that's really dependent upon the water supply on the stream, probably, right? In terms of driving the mill. Because these little rivulets were not like a stream that would run year round a lot of times. But 200, 250 days a year produces a bloom a day. But notice it employs all of these people, right? Right? And so if we take a little closer look, here we go, all right? So this image over here is what charcoaling would look like. But this one bloomery forge area, they had diggers for digging the ore, the carters, people hauling stuff. We've got people running the animals in the cart. We've got woodcutters, charcoal burners, stokers, puddlers, smiths, and the right. It employed between 60 and 70 people at any given time, keeping this place run. Okay, and so one of the things to kind of hold in our mind is this complex organization of all these people that are in support of one forge. Because when we're thinking about Southern England and we've got maybe 200 forges or maybe 75 things going on, we multiply that by the amount of people that are involved in the economic endeavor supporting one forge. We end up having a much different view of the complex activity that people were engaged in, let's say, in the high weald of Southern England during this period, right? Because we've got, so here we got Sussex has 50 mills in operation at various times in the 1300s. So 50 mills times 60, 70 people, that are engaging in various economic activities, right?
Excuse me,
Um,
Ivan, what is a puddler? I work with bloomer. I don't know what that is.
Yeah. These are, so when we're shifting to the bloomery, these are the people that are pulling the hot metal out.
Okay,
Right, they're
gotcha.
manipulating it.
Gotcha.
And that's where we get, later on, these are the people that would be involved in creating the pig iron, where the metal's actually coming out in a molten way. But the puddlers are the ones that are going to be breaking in there and pulling the bloom out and manipulating it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, so what's really kind of interesting is, at any given time in Sussex alone, we've got perhaps 2,000 trained individuals that are just working in the iron industry in various aspects of it, whether they're charcoalers or hauling. Now, some of the people, let's say the charcoalers or some of them would also perhaps have some other tasks they're doing. They might be farmers or peasants and they're doing it on the side. But at least in terms of the record, this is a lot of people. And we know in 1425, there's a record from outside of Dover, Hastings. It's outside of Hastings, Dover area. And they're talking about how when all the furnaces were in operation, the night sky for miles around was lit up. And that always strikes me is this is not the typical vision we have of pre-modern Europe, right? Where the night sky is lit up for miles around because of all these forges going. So this is part of that idea of thinking about the medieval world a little differently here. Okay, and this is a model from a museum in Britain, but this gives you kind of a typical version of the kind of blast furnace that comes on late in the period. Blast furnaces, much more efficient. They're still using large water wheels, mechanical power to drive it, pushing the air in. But if we look at the top of this, you can see these people, and you would have wagons and stuff, and you literally can drop the charcoal and the metal through the top, and the puddler down here at the bottom is pulling out the molten metal. And they called it pig iron because as it came out, it would go into these little bar areas along the side, and it looked like baby pigs suckling a mom, right? You get all these red things. But these, are producing tons of stuff. And Henry VIII, with his wars in England, was really concerned with having a independent supply of iron for cannon and shot. And with the blast furnace in southern England, there's a lot of records of how much they were buying and from whom. And so we have a pretty detailed record by the Tudor period about the iron industry as it expanded. Okay, and so here we have some examples, of what some kinds of things are going on by 1574 in southern England. All right, okay. So just a little bit later, but still kind of on this, just because it gives us a data point. Okay, Lord Dudley, he did a survey. This is with England post Elizabeth, but they're working on civil wars, and they're just trying to figure out what kind of resources they can tap on for the military. And so he did a survey, and there was about 100 to 150 furnaces, blast furnaces, and at any given time there was what they called 75 stable furnaces. And so there were 75 that they could reliably depend upon for cannon and shot. Okay, and modern scholars that have gone through this stuff gives us some estimate about what the production would have been on 75 stable furnaces here at 1611. So we're looking at 20 to 45,000 tons of pig iron, another 15 to 30 tons of bar iron, scattered across 75 or so furnaces across that Sussex, Kent area that would be the high wheeled. So still, and when we times each of those stable furnaces by 50, 60 people in support of them, we've got a lot of people involved in this as an economic endeavor, okay? And remind yourself that in terms of these complex machines, you know, there's more people are going to be out there with the grain and the textile stuff. So the iron industry is number 3 on our list in terms of sheer numbers of people involved. All right. Now, at this point, we're just going to kind of run through a couple other kinds of economic activities that were going on in southern England using this large mechanical power, just to fill out how these large machines and the technology were in operation in England during this period. So another large-scale endeavor is salt production. And we have furnaces and blast furnaces. This image here is a modern living history museum from England that shows a salt pan. So you got a large metal pan that you would put salt water in, and they would just have charcoal underneath it, and you'd boil the water away to get the salt. And I'm sure many of you guys realize that in the medieval period, salt was a rare commodity. It was really valuable. It was used in all sorts of places. And so it shouldn't come as no surprise that there would be a thriving salt industry. It never was, in England, the salt industry was never sufficient to cover the demand. So there was always importing of salt. But in terms of fishing fleets and these sorts of things, large amounts of salt were really important. And so we see a lot of salt furnaces and references to this. Again, as a way of adding another bit to examining the kinds of economic activities that people are involved with in terms of seeing how things are. Okay, so we have a glass industry. Okay, glass industry, while it's not one of the big 3 in terms of southern England and economic activities, it's still there. There's a lot of, quite a number of people involved in it. It's another one of those industries that's very much forest dependent because it takes a lot of fuel, right? And so in terms of this forest economy, and so you need you're going to need access to water to drive some wheels for bellows. You're going to need access to sand, and you're going to need lots of fuel. And so this image on the side is a nice medieval drawing that kind of shows a glass operation, and you can see some of the various parts of it, the digging of the sand and the big ovens and all this sort of stuff in terms of that image. Okay, so some data points to just give us something to understand what's going on. The data on the glass industry is a little bit better later on. We know it's existing earlier on, but we just don't have as good a data on it. So by 1500 though, we've got some good data for Sussex and Cantonet in terms of what a typical operation might be. So you got a couple glass makers, and just like the iron industry, you've got a whole bunch of people in support, right? You got woodcutters and charcoalers and diggers and haulers and all of those sort of people bringing the material and allowing them to do it, okay? Now in terms of woodcutters and charcoalers, these glass operations are going through about 30 cords every 10 days. So that's a lot of wood. So if we're thinking about this wood fuel economy, you know, and kind of an aside to think about is at the Doomsday Survey, you know, 1086, at most, England was maybe 25, 30% wooded, right? England was not a wooded place. It was mostly deforested by the Roman times. And so for all of these industries to flourish through 1500s, there had to have been a lot of careful management of the woodlots and the forests and these sorts of things, so they're not overcutting, right? Because people needed wood for heating, for cooking. I mean, every aspect of their lives, they needed access to wood. And so these large-scale industries that are using tons of wood, they had to manage their forests, right? They had to, otherwise, you know, the stuff wouldn't survive for as long as it did. So some of the historians that talk about the deforestation, lack of wood driving the shift to coal in the 1700s just doesn't strike a chord of truth with me, because these industries flourished for so long in areas that were not particularly wooded to begin with. But anyway, so a typical glass maker is going to be, you know, 40 tons of glass. That's quite a bit of glass. You know, this is going to be a variety of stuff. It's drinking vessels, it's glass panes, windows, just all sorts of stuff, right? Obviously, compared to the kinds of stuff coming out of like Venice, Well, by the time we get to Elizabeth's reign, I mean, obviously Venetian glass is the gold standard, if you will, about glasswork. And they were busy trying to steal artisans away to bring them over so they could do Venetian style glass. So this probably isn't quite as elegant as that, or simply because of all of the shenanigans to steal Venetian technology in Elizabeth's reign. Which is a fun story if you're interested in medieval industrial espionage, right? The stealing of Venetian glass stuff is fun. Anyway, so looking at our wheeled region of southern England again for our snapshot, at any given time there's 15 or 16 of these in operation. So again, individually not a lot, but when we're adding that with the kinds of people that are helping out the support industry, the kind of resources they need, and adding it to the woolen industry, textiles, iron industry, it's just another piece in understanding this complex sort of economic activity that's going on in England in the high medieval period. Right? And all this stuff really is taken off after about 1100. Okay, whoop. Okay, so a couple of other kinds of things to look at here. Okay, that sort of bring a lot of this sort of stuff together. And we'll talk a little bit about this as well. We got the military shipbuilding, cathedral building. I'll hit the shipbuilding a little bit more in a second, but the cathedrals, again, when they're building these places like Westminster and these places are bringing lots of skilled craftsmen in and a lot of economic support there. It's not quite as industrial as we think, but when we're talking about large scale, complex endeavors happening over large periods of time, I just want to kind of mention the cathedral building in terms of the organization of local and regional economies in support of these large endeavors. Because they very much shape a lot of the regions for long periods of time. Okay, so shipbuilding is another area where we see a lot of complex sorts of economic activities and kind of industrial sorts of things going on. What's interesting is we've got the fishing industry, and in this period there's basically 3 general fleets. And for the most part of the shipping industry, a lot of these towns and a lot of these isolated places where the fleets would go out from, they would have their own local residents for shipbuilding and maintaining the dry docks. So it's very localized that way. But the wood that they needed to maintain these things sometimes had to be shipped in from quite a ways away. And as we get towards the end of the medieval period, getting access to the hardwoods of the size and shape that you needed for building things was becoming more and more problematic. And that's why probably by 1700, a huge number of the British fleets in that high period that's outside where we are, they're being built in the American colonies, or the wood for the ships are being cut down in the American colonies and brought all the way back to England and then built. Especially the white pines that were long and straight for masts. But anyway, so we got a large-scale shipping industry. So we've got wood, we've got all the stuff going for that. We've also tied back to the salt in terms of those guys going out. There's 3 basic ones. What's really interesting is especially the Newfoundland fishing fleets, the ones that were coming over to the New World. They were very secretive about what they were doing in that. But again, by the late period, you know, that's a lot of salted fish a year that's coming out of this sort of general industry. Okay. There's also the merchant marines. This area is kind of interesting because for most of the medieval period, England wasn't known as a great shipbuilding culture. And so a lot of the ships for the merchants, for shipping and stuff, are going to be built elsewhere and then brought in. And it's just really the Tudors that really try to crank that up because they see that as a problem, right? Because they're wanting to expand and things like that. Okay. And then we have the military shipbuilding, and this is in Portsmouth and these other areas. Prior to the Tudors, it's not particularly significant, but by the time Henry VIII kicks on and we're building these large-scale ships, it becomes this huge industry. So this picture here is the Mary Rose, which is the most famous of the Tudor ones. And we know a lot about the Mary Rose, simply because they brought it up off the ocean floor. And so I have this here so you can have a picture in your mind eye what a typical ship of that sort of period would be. So to build one of these typical ships, it's going to take about 2,000 mature oaks, right? And the Royal Navy, and this is the numbers from Portsmouth, right? Portsmouth had about 2,000 mature oak trees a year just for maintenance of the existing ships. And if they were building another ship, they would have to lock that in. And what's interesting there is how they managed the forest in terms of accessing it. But for building of these warships, you also would need the cannons and the shots, and then with the textile industry in terms of making the sails and the ropes. And what's really interesting to me is looking at Portsmouth, how the military shipping industry, the building of these ships of war, brought together, all the aspects of the heavy industry of the medieval period and had it focused in one particular area. And you have all of these experts and all these trained people, and you've got all of these individuals that would have own shares of a particular mill. And so let's say you own, a third of some ironworks, and so a third of the cannons that were produced were yours, and then you would negotiate with the king to sell them to Portsmouth for these battleships. And Henry's offices got tired of doing all that particular stuff, and so they started negotiating cutting these bank checks and sending it out to these people. And so the shareholding starts to become less of actually getting X amount of the product from the mill, and you're just getting a check every year. And you start seeing during the groups that are supporting Portsmouth and the military industry, groups of people, not nobles, just regular, owning multiple aspects of this. So you might own part of an ironwork, and you might own part of a facility that produces sails, and you might own part of a facility that makes barrels, and all these things together, and then you get these sort of lump payments for that. And so we start seeing stuff that starts looking remarkably modern in terms of the economy, right? In terms of how people are modifying all this sort of stuff. So anyway, so okay, so this went a little bit quicker than I wanted, but a little bit. So there's any questions I can ask about this? Because the main goal of this is to transform how we see the medieval world, right? To not think of medieval England simply as an agrarian society, and to realize that the people living in England in the high medieval period are in a complex world. They're familiar with machines. These large water-driven, wind-driven machines are part of their everyday life. And this creates a culture where people can invest in building these large machines that exist over a period and get benefit coming back, that I think sets it up later for when we see an industrial revolution, that all of this sets the groundwork that allows that to sort of explode. But anyway, so I'm going to stop there. I wanted to make sure I didn't run over time, and I was talking super fast, so I went through it quicker than I thought. But does anybody have any questions on particular bits of this you want me to revisit or delve deeper into?
Hello, Killian. I have a question for you.
Sure.
So when we think about the Industrial Revolution in both England and America and, the early 20th and 19th centuries, there's so much of with pollution and how much it changed that. Does that come up at all in the, in your research or anything? Is noting of pollution at all?
Not with respect to the heavy industry. I mean, there is some complaints, right? There is some complaints about the smoke and stuff like that. But, the conditions in London and some of the major cities in terms of sewage and I didn't even get into tanning. I mean, the leather industry is huge, right? And all this stuff. So there is a lot of that stuff, but, it just kind of sucked. If you live in the city, you didn't live in that areas. But we do have a few records from in the 1400s where in Kent or Sussex, I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but there was an actual peasant revolt or two where the local peasants armed and charged the local sheriff because the iron industry and the glass industry was using more than their share of the wood products. Because, you know, it's a wood fuel economy and everybody had to have access to the parks and the chases and all these different kinds of places to heat your house and cook your food and all that stuff. And if one particular area took more than their share, and so there is some peasant revolts, and it must be 1500 because it's the Star Chamber under Henry VIII did the investigation. And basically they said the peasants were all out of line, which may be, but there was that popular conception, right? That this large industry might be using more than their share of the resources which everyone depended, right? So I think that and also I had that quote from 1400s about how the night sky was lit up at night from all this stuff. And so there's at least some awareness in a couple places of people kind of going, is it using more than its share? I know that the iron industry and a lot of that stuff took a huge hit in the 1300s as the plague came through, and huge areas of southern England were like depopulated, right? And so some of these pressures for access to the woods and things like that, I think that we're building didn't happen because of when the plague hit and a lot of these places go out of business, and it really sets things back 60, 80 years before it starts coming forward. But yeah, so there's some tangential stuff, but it's not, you know, more than people saying it's smoky or stinky, or, you know, the access to the woodlots and the peasant revolts are the only real big things that I can remember hearing.
Thank you. And yeah, like it's not that much different than anything in modern history with people complaining about, you know, who gets their share and tragedy of the commons and all that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, any other questions or comments people have that would like to?
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for helping put into scale the sheer number of people that one of these things. That's what really got to me, was the amount of materials is interesting, but just the amount of labor required for what seems like maybe a small operation.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that I think is really interesting, is when you start adding it up, right? And for me, just looking at the high weald area in southern England and Sussex and Kent, when you start adding, you know, the people involved in flour and that part of the economy, and then the fullering mills, and then the iron industry and the glass industry and the salt, and you start putting it all together, and you start locking it into a region not much bigger than the Boise Valley or not much bigger than the Wasatch Front, right? Because you know, that southern region between the North and South Downs isn't that big by Western standards, right? And you start having all of that in what we would think here in the Western United States is a relatively small area. It changes your understanding of what it would be like to live in that area, right? That these complex machines are ubiquitous. This stuff's all over the place. It's not what we would normally think of as a Tolkien fantasy agrarian sort of world, for sure. You know.
Ivan,
Yes.
in your various readings, have you encountered any mention of actual steam being used even in toys? I know they didn't use it commercially, but even in toys?
You know, there's some evidence back in the Hellenistic period, right?
Yes, 250 BC they were doing, but that doesn't seem to have survived past. Let's see, who would have died then? I can't remember. I'd have to go back.
Yeah,
and look.
it's in the 300s BC, right? That, you know, we've got the, you know, but there's still even their novelty. I mean, there was the opening and closing of the doors in the library or whatever by steam.
That was water. That wasn't
That was
steam.
water.
Tariq al-Din was using steam to drive a cooking spit in 15 something. But I was wondering if you'd encountered any Western mention of the idea.
Not really. I mean, I think we're looking early 1700s. I'd have to go dig around, but when they start shifting to coal up in the Midland, so we're looking up around Colebrookdale and Ironbridge, you know, that area, they were basically running big wheels, like a water wheel, but they started experimenting with using the coal for fuel to push this. And it was these giant pistons to just shove air down into the mines.
Yeah.
Right? And so you got these wheels and these pistons the size of my house, right? I mean, they're not small things. Were some of the earliest, you know, that I know of. But
Yeah, you're right about the 1700s and the commercialization. I was just wondering if they were puttering about with it more than as possibly a toy or even just toys.
Yeah, the complex toys, the complex machines in this period are going to be your clockmakers.
Yes.
Right?
And that isn't steam either.
Yeah, but every city of any renown is going to want to have a clock tower, right? In terms of prestige. And if they can afford it, they're going to have a clock tower, and anybody of any wealth, middle class, whatever, they're going to want to have some sort of clock on the shelf. And so there is this minor industry of all this, and these are making these complex, small sort of objects, right? And that produces the technology and the industry that allows the building of muskets and all that stuff on the firearms, right? Because you got all these people that are making these sorts of things. And so the whole notion of time and clockmaking and how that transforms in this period, well, that would be a whole separate hour-long conversation, right? Because this idea of time, right, and timekeeping and organizing in cities with these clock towers cranking out, that's another transformation of how people see themselves in the world. That's kind of an interesting thing to play with too. But yeah, so the clockmaking is what I would think of, but I haven't seen anything for steam that I've run across. Somebody else might.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what sources you would recommend for those of us who want to delve deeper into this topic.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, there's a ton of stuff in terms of individual essays and monographs. There's a husband and wife team, Gee's Cathedral and Water Wheel, that is probably the most easily accessible one to explore. And after that, you're really going to hop into more scholarly treatments that are targeted at different aspects of it. So you would look at a monograph that looks at the wood fuel economy and how that worked, or you'd have a book on the iron industry of England, or a book on the textile industry, right? So other than the Cathedral and Water Wheel book, which is, gosh, about 30 years old, so it's maybe due for someone to write a new one. Most of the history written since 1980 is mostly this micro history stuff, right? Where people dial in on particular towns or particular regions, particular industries, and they do these real deep dives. And so, yeah. So I would say start with that one, and then if there's a particular kind of industry you're interested in, I could probably turn you on a book or two that would dial in on that. Okay. Any other questions? So did you guys find this enlightening? I know Giuliano said the sheer numbers of people. She found that interesting.
I'm shocked still by the water wheels. I can't get past that, you know, because you don't think of that. You think of like the Hollywood picture of, oh, on this one river, there's one water wheel. No. There's, you know, a lot.
Yeah. Especially when you get it close to London, right? And those small rivers dropping into the Thames near London, those suckers are packed. You're gonna have 4, 5, 6, 8, you know, both vertical and horizontal ones, you know, every mile. So, yeah.
Killian, I actually got to see a video of one of the huge hammers, like you were talking about using on the ore in the blooms.
Right.
Couple years ago, somebody had it on YouTube, and I think it was in Scandinavia, and they actually had one of these that they rebuilt, and used a water wheel and had it going, and it was insane. It was. I was just like a kid in a candy store watching it. You know, me being a blacksmith, that was hilarious. But that was impressive. It was scary, the technology they had back then.
Well, I find it
Approximately,
fascinating.
approximately a year ago, I was actually standing inside of a Dutch windmill watching it work. Now that's some fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the things we don't realize is in the medieval period, the English coastline was covered in windmills. There were just tons of windmills in England. Almost none of them survived because they were mostly wooden structures. But yeah, pretty common. Okay, well, I'm going to call this good because I have to reset. I'm hosting the next class for Nicolina, and so we need to kind of flip this channel. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. If you haven't, hop the link to the Google document to put your name down so that we have record that you took the class.
Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you all for joining me. We all know teaching these SCA classes, it's nice to have a few people join you because sometimes you teach them and there's 1 or 2 people show up. So.
And other times we open it to the known world.
And there we go. Yay!
Thanks.
Yes, half of us are from somewhere else, so thank you.
Perfect. Well, this is great. This is great. Okay. Hello. All right, so I got to see if the person that's teaching the next class is working about. Okay.